So in the first game of the Nordic Championship, I quickly reached a quite comfortable position against Tenold Andreas, Norwegian junior. I actually, to be honest, I thought I had a strategically won position after my 11th move c5, since this is a move claiming that I am actually better on both flanks. And I thought I would simply just prepare b5 here, but I understood later on move 18 that things were actually not so simple, and now having organized all my pieces to prepare for b5, I realized that that was actually not really ideal for me to play. For instance, if I prepare it a little bit more, white can simply opt for b4, and in this position I am simply not really ready yet to play b5 without giving up a pawn. So I had to play one of the toughest moves of my career, I would say, a5. It's a really ugly move after having really prepared everything for b5. Nonetheless, I felt like I was still potentially better on the king side, and so did he, because he didn't try to open up there. I'm pretty sure that's close to equal if he had tried that, dynamically equal. But he didn't really try anything, and on move 44, his last move, queen c1, was an inaccuracy. Here both players have really tried to coordinate their pieces in order to prepare as best as they can for g4, but I didn't really have to do that now, and I was able to complicate the position with bishop takes h3. White here should probably have just played rook h2 and tried to get some counterplay with his knight to f5, although that also leaves black with some hopes, practically speaking at least. Bishop takes g5 was a mistake, and I quickly returned the favor. I didn't really understand the nuances here. The most appealing move is rook hg6, but then takes, rook takes, knight takes g6. And this is really a disaster for white, and for some reason I guess my concentration was not on top here. I was really shocked by his bishop takes g5, and I went for bishop takes g2, thinking that this position here would be great for me, but I had failed to realize that white was actually ready for some counterplay with f4 immediately, and so I had to waste another move with queen e7. Nonetheless, my passed h pawn caused white too much trouble, and he quickly got into time trouble once again, and his move knight e1, move 50, was making things very easy for me. I could just push my h pawn and penetrate white's position with my queen. So a good, solid start. In the second round I played against Patachnikova Lenka, sorry for that pronunciation, from Iceland, probably one of the strongest female players there, used to be 2300. Anyway, I got a pleasant start of the game. I played 7-8-3, inviting to reversed pano in the King's Indian line with a tempo more for white. Black didn't want to enter my territory and decided to play with a5, which created a long-term weakness on b5 that seemed to be a problem for the rest of the game. Nonetheless, black was fine even when we traded queens, but the real problem started in this position where black got a bit impatient in time trouble and decided to play f5. This is a sort of Italian structure, and whenever this pawn cannot be protected by another pawn anymore, it becomes a huge problem for black in this structure, much more of a problem than the d3 pawn is for white. And that became apparent in this position here after bishop g5. For instance, if black takes on d3, then we can see that white's pieces are much more threatening than black's. And the final blow that I had to find here was f4 after black refused to trade dark square bishops. The point being that black can't really take the pawn since the knight is under heavy attack, and if rook takes d3, which is what happened in the game, then f takes e, and my pieces are simply too active now, and this passed pawn is also going to queen one day if black doesn't defend that pawn with all his pieces, all her pieces. Being on 2 out of 2, I was getting confident and decided to play in a kind of risky manner in the Dutch defense against Thorn Eric from Sweden. And objectively speaking, this was pretty bad, but it was really difficult for white to find the correct moves as well. And on move 14, white played in this super complicated position. White played f3, which was an inaccuracy because now I had the possibility of playing h6 without having to worry about queen h5 check. And unfortunately, I missed that possibility and went for bishop b4, which was objectively losing in some really bizarre line had white started out with bishop takes c6 here, and then there's some super strange queen maneuver to a3 afterwards, but I'm not gonna feel too sorry about missing that. Instead, f takes e was what I had anticipated, and in this position, notice that if white tries queen h6, there's a nice tactic here followed by queen takes f1 followed by bishop f8. He saw that obviously and went for queen f3, and now we reached a forced sequence after rook f8. Everything comes off, and apparently black is more than fine here. The evaluation is equal, but it's probably more difficult for white to play actually. So I got a pleasant endgame, and on move 31 here we traded into a opposite color bishop and knight endgame, which is probably a draw objectively speaking, but he went wrong on move 39 here, where he could have just simply played bishop g7 and it's still just a draw, but he got a little bit impatient and went for the tactic bishop takes e5. Admittedly, I hadn't seen that when I moved my king, so I was a bit lucky that this resulting position here was just very unpleasant for white and probably losing actually, because I got a past a pawn and white could never trade knights because of that. And also this pawn is actually making it more difficult for white to have mobility here. So yeah, it became obvious on move 47 that this was going to be a win for me. I started the tournament rather well, and I got my biggest challenge so far playing John Ludwig Hammer. And the openings seemed to be working well for me when I played 11 c5, the point being that if he takes, I was going to recapture with a d pawn, and then I thought that my knight can compensate for my slightly defect pawn structure. In addition to that, black had to worry about bishop a3, which was probably not such a big deal because he could have played simply b5 and c4 and basically do short side castles by manually, or how to say. Nonetheless, he played d5, and in this structure I understood that it would be a long strategical battle, and eventually black is going to carry through g5 and f4, which is white's concern. Nonetheless, this is sort of like a French, and often I can simply play e takes f and put my bishop on e3, which is why I thought my king was safe in the long run here, and I started to carry out the really strange maneuver knight b1, which I really don't understand how I managed to fool myself into doing, since first of all the knight is very important on d2. Whenever I take on d5 now, black is more or less forced to take back with a pawn to prevent white from getting his knight to d6. And so the knight was actually doing a good job on d2, but I sort of forgot about that, and I started thinking more about trying to win control over the d5 square in combination with pressuring b7, which just gave black simple development. And And here it became clear that I had just been fooling around basically, not really achieving anything. Still, if black had to take back with on d5 with his pawn, then everything would have been justified, since my knight could have also come to b5, but he simply doesn't have to do that anymore. And after b5, it became clear that black was just slightly better, because my dark squared bishop is not really a great piece here, and it's easy to see that black's knights are going to be quite strong after something like knight b6, knight c4, or knight d5. Nonetheless, white's position should be possible to save here, and things were looking more or less solid on move 32. But here I made a huge, I would say, positional mistake. In general, I was happy having my bishop on e1, since it was doing protective. It had a protective duty there. But putting it on c5 became a long-term problem. My bishop never really came out of there, and as you can see in this position here, I assumed that this bishop would give me some counterplay. First of all, it's also preventing black from playing rook f8 and f4, but I also thought that on a good day I could play bishop f8 in combination with the 7th rank, which is why I played rook b7 and actually immediately threatening bishop f8. But I had missed a serious counter blow here, queen g6, and the point being that after bishop f8, black can simply play knight takes e3. And it's game over, since it's mate on g2. And after that, my position was actually not really, it wasn't possible to save my position. And funnily enough, I touched my rook here, and I was intending to play rook b8. The point being that after knight takes e3, it's countermate. But before I let my piece go, I noticed that black could simply take on f2 here, and my king is still, even if I get to trade rooks here, my king is still in huge trouble. So that would not have been worth a pawn, and instead I let the rook go. I let go of the rook on the b3 square instead, which put up a fight, and Hammer had to find some good moves. I was impressed by his move on move 47, queen d7, which is very elegant and simple. His idea is just to play queen c7 and knight g3, after which white is defenseless. Notice how my bishop on c5 still just isn't doing anything at all. Had it been on e1, then that idea wouldn't really have worked for black, and he would have had to find a different way. I tried to prevent queen c7 check by playing king h1 first, but it turned out that black could just carry through the idea nonetheless, and his rook on the 2nd rank was simply too strong. Having just lost to Hammer, I entered the 5th round playing against the Norwegian junior talent, Wittenberg Noam, who made FM during the tournament at age 15. I was not so impressed by his play in the opening. After knight g5, I simply got in h6 and g5, and I reached a very pleasant middle game position, which I thought was close to winning for black in the Leningrad Dutch defense. The point here is that all of white's minor pieces can't really do anything, and a move like f3 simply runs into e3, and here white can't even try f4 because g4 would trap his knight. So that just goes to show how big white's problems are. And after c4 on move 21, it's obvious that even his dark squared bishop is a terrible piece. And even if he managed to play f4, it didn't really change anything, since his pieces still can't really enter. The only thing that I had to be careful about here was not allowing g4 at the appropriate time. And here I would say the engine doesn't think that my move here was a big mistake, simply playing rook c6, but the intuitive move was to play rook a4. And there's a huge difference actually, that now if white plays a3, it's a bit more difficult to carry through his idea of c4 and then trading bishops, leaving the g5 pawn vulnerable, since the a3 pawn is hanging in all of the lines, and so would the e3 pawn be. The only reason why I didn't play rook a4 was because I was slightly concerned that I would have to worry about some ideas of trapping my rook, and I thought there was no need to have to worry about that, and I played the somewhat lazy move rook c6, which allowed c4, but okay, my position was still fine here had I only played a simple idea like knight g6 to e5. However, I was slightly worried about allowing white any counterplay at all, but it seems that this is no problem at all. So here I went wrong with rook fc8, and I lost track of g4, which was now a good timing for white to execute that. And unfortunately for me, this is now just an equal endgame. I decided to trade everything here since white's pieces were getting really active, and we reached this endgame here where I could have still easily held a draw if I had just realized that there was no chances anymore to win. But I saw in his time trouble, I got optimistic and saw some nasty mating ideas, or at least some ideas that could cause white problems. And so far everything is good, king e6, but here I did a terrible mistake. White just being a few minutes down on the clock. I should have just played king e5 here, and white can't really make much progress since king g3 runs into knight f5 check at all times. And so white would probably have to check again, but instead I went king f5, and now that was simply a blunder, because now white can play king g3 with the idea of taking on g4 and playing rook f6 mate actually. And I had seen king g3, but I didn't realize that in this position white simply plays king h3, and I still can't capture the knights on g4. And now it's just a lost position for black, because after knight g8 I can't ever move anything else than my rook for the rest of the game, and he displayed good technique and maneuvered his king over to b6, after which I had to just resign. So that was a very unfortunate game, losing 2 games in a row. Knowing that my tournament had already gone down the drain, I decided to change something in my playing style. I decided to play much faster and to stop overthinking things so much. And this has its advantages, but it also has its downsides. And after I played 12 d takes c5 here, black actually had the possibility of playing d4, after which he would have had just very nice position. Anyway, he played b takes c5, and I was more or less okay again. I was fighting for an advantage here, and especially after his ugly move d4, his light squares became terribly weak, and white reached a very preferable position. However, I didn't play this accurately, but on move 23 I won a pawn nonetheless, playing bishop takes h3 here. Black overlooked that after I play b takes c here, b takes, the pawn is lost. And so I thought that I had a winning position, which is probably true, but it was not so easy to convert. And having lost 2 games in a row, I was trying to regain some confidence slowly here, and so I missed some. I didn't play precise. I missed some finishers, but when I finally got in e3 and f4, even though I just returned a pawn, I had wonderful bishops and a passed pawn, and I only had to worry about black's knight and looking out for tricks. Having said that, I actually had to find an only winning idea here, an only move that wins here, which was really surprising to me. So he put up a good fight, and the point here is that very often black collects my a7 pawn and enters a opposite color bishop endgame, or this pawn just creates huge problems for me. But after bishop f3 e2, The only move to win was king g2, which I found, which I fortunately found. The point here is that black's king has huge problems as well, since it doesn't have any space. So there's always the mating themes, and the game followed like this. And here I had actually my first intention here was just to take on a8, if I'm not mistaken, allowing black to queen, and then white will escape the checks after queen d7, bishop g4, and then he will queen next move, and then I can even bring my queen back to g2 and my king is totally safe. Nonetheless, rook e3 was much simpler and black was forced to resign here. Having finally won a game again, I was playing the almost equally high-rated Rydström Tom from Sweden, and this was probably my most exciting game of the tournament. I think my opening was fine, but I was a bit too optimistic when I played b4, going for this structure here, where white has really nice squares for his pieces. Notice how white's knight can get into d5 here. Nonetheless, I compared this to Rai Lopez position, and I thought that it didn't really matter so much. I have my own things going after knight h5. But I didn't understand that I had to commit to playing g5 in this position, since the e5 pawn is a permanent problem, tactically speaking, and I can't play f6 yet because of white's light squared bishop. So when I played b4 earlier, I didn't realize that I was actually basically forced to play g5 in this position. And then white should be considerably better, but it's still not so easy, and black has some tricks of his own. And the good thing was that white spent a lot of time, whereas my moves were rather easy, I would say. So I had a huge advantage on the clock. White played, I think, pretty well here. Knight e5. I notice, yeah, I still can't play f6, although that's probably ideal if my king had been on g7. I was forced to put my bishop on f6, which was not so bad. But white played rather strongly here, queen e3, with the idea that sometimes now he can just take on e5 and enter an endgame. Although this is not really that much of a threat. Say I play something like king g7, takes, everything comes off, and then I play f6. Okay, now there's actually the check on e7, which is a bit worrisome, but the point I was trying to make was that this d5 pawn would also become would probably be lost actually after bishop e7. But king g7 was not the best here. A better example would have been king f8, I guess. Nonetheless, I felt forced I felt compelled to play c4 here, having with some ideas of playing b3 and also sorry sorry about that making the pawn on d5 more vulnerable. But it turned out to be a mistake, because I had overlooked queen e4, and the main idea for white here is not that he wants to gain this pawn, but that he wants to create a battery against my exposed king. But my first thought was that that was not so dangerous actually, because queen h7, and I would simply play king f8, and then my bishop would be protecting everything. That's not completely true though, and after b3 here, you can see that after takes check, white actually could have finished me off here already with a strong move knight h4. The point being that, first of all, I can't really take it since white checks and takes on h4 with check, after which my king has no defense anymore basically. And the other point is that knight g6 check is threatened since my queen is hanging, and if I play a move like what move is it, queen d6, then white could have played something like bishop f5, and my coordination is just destroyed here. Nonetheless, he played inaccurate, didn't find that one. It should also be mentioned that in this position I should have just played the most intuitive move, king f8, and things are actually not so bad. Like I mentioned, the end game is decent for black. I think takes check, king h2, and this sort of end game here. Even though white is a pawn up, black has enough counterplay going. But rook b5 was too much. I had missed knight h4. Fortunately for me, he also missed it, and on move 35 I actually reached a winning position because now my king was totally safe and I have some material advantage as well as the bishop pair and better placed pieces, I would say, especially after rook f1 here. Still, things were far from easy, and I had to keep my calm here and actually run with my king to d4 to avoid the perpetual checks. There were other ways to win here, but this was ironically what seemed to be the easiest for me. And here white runs out of checks. he is forced to push me to the a file, but after black's king enters the a file, the bishop can come back as a protective piece as well. And the problem for white is that his knight is still out of play. So things went rather smoothly here, and now there were multiple ways of doing it. I decided to play it like this, where my king was the safest. I felt having a bishop up should be enough to win the game, which it turned out to be, with no serious problems after that. So having won 2 games in a row, I had built up my confidence again, and like I said, I had chances to get a medal now, actually, I think. And I tried to play quite energetically against my friend Benjamin Arvela, who recently became a grandmaster. But it seems like I got no advantage at all out of the opening, and playing c5 here was more like rolling a dice. I understood that after knight takes, queen takes, okay, say b takes, d takes, f6 here, for instance. Now I can play queen e3 or queen g3. If I play queen g3, the point is that black doesn't want to take on c5 yet because the e5 pawn is hanging, but he should play something like e5. And this position was super difficult for me to evaluate, but nonetheless I felt compelled to go for this, since after his move knight e7, his piece placement was basically begging for bishop b5. And I didn't really see any other convincing way of playing this. Notice that most of the game I had the possibility of playing a structure like this, but even here I'm not sure how much of a problem my pass pawn is for black. So I went for c5, and while black admittedly panicked at first, he calmed down and found the strong counterblow d4, which is logical since it's opening up for black's pieces. And I had underestimated this one, and I totally lost my calm actually. Here I should have just played bishop takes d4. Sorry, not rook d5 runs into mate, of course. So f6, something like this. Bishop takes c5 and queen h3, where the position is still sort of balanced, but I actually evaluated this to be quite bad for me, since his bishops look so intimidating. So I thought instead that it would be more logical to trade light squared bishops, but I failed to realize here in this position that my king is actually a huge problem, and which is why I'm probably going to lose this pawn without any compensation. Say I play c6, I think just simply rook takes c6, rook takes c6, queen takes a7, and here I think black has a way of just, yeah, maybe queen c2 is good enough, threatening rook d1 and queen takes b2. So my king was simply too exposed, and the pawn structure on the king side also heavily favors the black's dark squared bishop and his king as well. So I thought this position was actually close to being lost now, and I didn't really put up a fight here playing rook takes a7. It ran into multiple ideas of black, like even queen e2 here, I think is possible. The idea being rook takes, rook d1 mate, or rook takes e2, takes, and rook d1. So many ideas, but he played the simplest, queen d3, and I simply resigned, losing all chances of medal in the tournament. So in the last round, I was trying to leave the tournament with my head high, so I wanted to play a good game and preferably win, of course, against this Norwegian junior Trygstad, who has 1 or 2 IM norms, and he was actually also playing for his he was playing for another IM norm in our game, but he had to win, and so it was a very exciting situation to be in. And I quickly got the upper hand from the opening, I would say, since I surprised him in the opening, and he didn't know this line very well, where white has some issues with pawn a4, and he went for the critical line, knight f5. The point being that after takes, white gets some, I would say, rather serious counterplay going here. Although maybe I'm not sure if it's objectively correct, but it was enough to scare me into playing the most intuitive move for me, at least, bishop f6, after which he could have still been better. But maybe I figured out that the simplest for black would have simply been to play knight bd7, forgetting about the a4 pawn. The most important thing in this position is simply to carry through d5, and I think this is simply better for black. Anyway, after bishop f6 takes here, queen g4 would have been slightly unpleasant again. The point being that in this position, the b file is a long-term problem for. Oh, sorry, I can't take that. I can't take on a4 immediately, since it's protected. I would have to play something like queen f6, but here the b file is a permanent problem for me. So queen g4 would have been a good move, but you went for queen knight e4, which was a mistake, because now white has some serious strategical trouble with his bishop. If black gets in b5 and c4, white is lost. I'm not sure when he saw the saving resource for that theme, but here after b5 he found the super strong bishop e6, which I had totally overlooked. And the idea is that basically he's threatening perpetual check if I take it, and rook d7. I even actually have to worry about that he might just take on e6 sometimes. Of course, I can't take here immediately, since that would actually end up in mate. So I played knight b6, still trying to fight for a win. I think we both were. And okay, he can carry through his idea in another way as well, with rook g3, and we have basically the same thing. Objectively speaking, I think white can achieve a draw at maximum here, but he played incorrectly, and I got a very dangerous pass pawn, and his attack simply didn't work anymore. And here I should have just played rook d1 and take the victory home. I saw rook d1, obviously, but his last moves had been, he has been living on increment for the last few moves, executing his moves with only 1 second left on the clock, and I thought bishop d7 was simply a poor way of stalling the outcome of the game. For instance, like this. Yes, something like this, and I thought that this would somehow give white the possibility of playing a few more moves, and I thought this was his idea, and so I just simply went for a2 here. And I also thought that his other idea was that if I play rook d1 here, takes, and this position here, I thought that, annoyingly enough, I would have to play for a few more moves, and that was a really lazy and bad attitude, and so I just went for a2, having compared those lines, and I simply missed that white does have a final trick. He probably missed that as well, since he played king h2 first, but it's going to be the same anyway. And then rook e7, and that's I had seen, but I thought white's trickery ended after rook h4, but then as you can see, the the super how to say, the super annoying bishop e8 just ruins the game for black. And at first I have to admit that I thought I was just losing after rook f8, but then it would have been too much to lose this game, and it's just a perpetual after king g8. That was a very cold shower, and instead of leaving with my head high, I was just so frustrated at myself for being so unprofessional that I didn't just play rook d1 here. So maybe I got a little bit overconfident, I'm not sure, but I'm going to have to fix those kind of issues. I can't be throwing away points like that. Anyway, I'm looking forward to my next tournament already. I've been training quite a lot. Norwegian Championship coming up on Friday, so I will see how that goes.